In a land that mistakes kindness for weakness, one woman's choice would echo through the canyons of the Arizona Territory. She was a widow alone, with nothing but a patch of stubborn dirt and the ghost of a husband to her name. He was a warrior, hunted and starving, with nothing but the burning pride of the Apache people in his eyes. She offered a piece of bread and a dipper of water. It was a simple, desperate act of mercy, one that should have been a secret, whispered only to the wind. Instead, that single act of compassion would unleash a storm, for at the breaking of the next dawn he returned, leading 50 riders to her door. This is the story of that debt, and how it was repaid in thunder and fire. The silence of the Arizona Territory was a physical thing. It had weight pressing down, with the heat of the sun filling the spaces between the sharp cracks of drying timber and the lonesome cry of a hawk circling in the vast, indifferent blue. For Elara Hayes, that silence was a constant companion, a shroud she had worn for the 2 years since she'd buried her husband Elias. Their homestead was a testament to his ambition and her endurance. A small, sturdy cabin of cottonwood and sod a well that was more prayer than promise, and a dozen acres of land that fought them for every blade of corn. It was nestled in a shallow valley, a stone's throw from the Dragoon Mountains, which stood like jagged purple sentinels against the horizon. The locals in the dusty town of Redemption, a hard day's ride away, called it Elias's Folly. After he'd been taken by the fever, they started calling it the widow's burden. Elara, however, simply called it home. Her days were a rhythm of survival. She rose before the sun painted the eastern sky. Her hands, though slender, were calloused from the pump handle, the hoe, and the heavy Winchester rifle she'd learned to use, as well as any man. She tended her small flock of chickens, mended the fence, where coyotes had been testing it, and worked the small vegetable patch with a grim determination. Every evening she would sit on the porch, the Winchester across her lap, and watch the mountains bleed color as the sun died. It was Apache land, Chiricahua Apache. The name itself was a whispered warning in Redemption, a story told to frighten children and chasten boastful men. Cochise and his warriors were ghosts of the mountains, seen only when they wished to be. Elara had never seen one. She only felt their presence in the profound, watchful stillness of the land. Her nearest neighbor, a grizzled old prospector named Jedediah Miller, would sometimes stop by on his way to town. "You ought to sell this place, Elara," he'd say, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Ain't right for a woman alone out here. Not with Silas Blackwood owning everything from here to the San Pedro River." Silas Blackwood. The name left a taste like rust in her mouth. He was a cattle baron with a soul as barren as the alkali flats he ran his herds on. He had tried to buy her land twice. Elias had laughed in his face. After Elias died, Blackwood's offer had turned into a veiled threat. The reason was simple and as vital as life itself, water. Her well was shallow, but the whispering creek at the edge of her property, though small, ran clear and true even in the driest seasons. It was the only reliable water source for 10 miles. For a man like Blackwood, whose cattle were dying of thirst, that creek was worth more than gold. This land was bought with Elias's sweat. She'd told Blackwood on his last visit, her hand never far from the Colt peacemaker Elias had taught her to wear on her hip. "It's not for sale." Blackwood, a thick man with cold, pig-like eyes, had simply smiled. It was not a pleasant sight. "Everything has a price, Mrs. Hayes, or a cost." That had been a month ago. Since then, the silence had grown heavier, more menacing. Her chickens had grown skittish. The nights seemed darker. She felt watched. It was on a blistering afternoon in late August that the silence was finally broken. The heat shimmered off the baked earth, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and dry sage. Ilara was pulling water from the well when she saw him. He wasn't there one moment, and the next he was standing at the edge of the scrub as if he'd materialized from the heat itself. An Apache. He was tall and lean, his body a corded map of muscle and sinew. He wore only a breechcloth and worn moccasins. His black hair was held back by a simple leather band. There was no paint on his face, but his skin was the color of rich earth, streaked with dirt and dried blood. A deep, jagged gash ran along his ribs, crusted and angry-looking. But it was his eyes that seized her. They were dark, fierce, and filled with a pain so profound it seemed to pull all the light from the air around him. He held no weapon, but he stood with the unbending stillness of a mountain predator. He was starving. It was etched into the hollows of his cheeks, the tautness of his skin over his ribs. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He simply watched her, his gaze unwavering. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct, every story she'd ever heard screamed at her to run inside, bar the door, and grab the Winchester. He was the enemy, the savage from the mountains. He was the reason men in redemption carried guns and slept with one eye open. She froze her hand, gripping the wet rope of the well bucket. The dipper clattered to the ground. The warrior's eyes flickered to the sound, then back to her face. He was dying on his feet. She could see it. He swayed almost imperceptibly, a man holding himself upright by sheer force of will. He made no plea, no gesture. His pride was a shield even in the face of death, and in that moment, Ilara saw not an Apache, not a savage, but a man. A man in the same desperate fight for life that she was, that Elias had been. She saw the same defiance in his eyes that she felt in her own heart every morning. She woke up to face the world alone. Slowly, deliberately, she let go of the rope. Her heart was a wild drum, but her hands were steady. She turned away from him and walked back toward the cabin, every inch of her back tingling, expecting the strike of an arrow, the rush of feet. Nothing came. The silence held, stretched thin and taut like a wire. The inside of the cabin was dark and blessedly cool. Ilara leaned against the heavy wooden door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Jedediah's warnings, Blackwood's threats, the grim tales of Apache, raids, they all screamed at her to bolt the door and wait for him to leave or die. To help him would be treason in the eyes of her own people. If anyone from redemption found out, she'd be branded an outcast, a sympathizer. They'd say she'd brought the devil to her own doorstep. Her eyes fell on the small sack of flour in the corner, and then to the half-loaf of bread sitting on the rough-hewn table wrapped in a linen cloth. It was her food for the next 2 days. Elias's voice echoed in her memory, a low, gentle rumble from a time when the silence wasn't so heavy. There's folks, and then there's human beings, Ilara. The trick is to remember they're all the second one, even when they act like the first. He was just a human being, starving, wounded, alone, with a resolve that came from a place deeper than fear. She took the bread. She filled a clean dipper with cool water from the bucket she'd just drawn. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlatched the door and stepped back out into the blinding glare of the sun. He hadn't moved. He stood like a statue, carved from the red rock of the canyons, his endurance a silent challenge to the sun itself. His dark eyes followed her every move. She walked slowly toward him, her body rigid with tension. She stopped 10 feet away, a distance that felt both immense and terrifyingly small. She held out the bread and the water. "Here," she said, her voice a dry rasp. For a long moment, he did nothing. His gaze dropped from her face to the offerings in her hands, then back to her face. He was reading her, she realized, searching for a trick for the poison in the gift. He saw only her plain, sun-weathered face, her worn calico dress, and the tremor in her hands that she couldn't quite conceal. Finally, with a slowness that seemed to cost him the last of his strength, he took a step forward. Then another. When he reached her, he didn't snatch the food. He gently, almost reverently, took the dipper first. He drank deeply, the water spilling down his chin and chest, washing away streaks of grime. He closed his eyes for a moment, and a shudder ran through his body, the pure animal relief of a thirst quenched at the very edge of oblivion. Then he took the bread. He broke off a small piece and ate it, his jaw working slowly. He didn't gorge himself like a starving man might, but ate with a deliberate, dignified control that was more powerful than any words. He ate half the loaf, then wrapped the other half in the linen cloth and tucked it into the waistband of his breechcloth. He looked at her one last time. His eyes, which had been burning with pain, now held a different light. It wasn't gratitude, not in the way she understood it. It was something deeper, a silent acknowledgement that a profound line had been crossed between them. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. And then he was gone. He didn't run. He simply turned and melted back into the landscape, vanishing into the shimmering heat and scrub as silently as he had appeared. Elara stood there for a long time, the empty dipper in her hand, the silence rushing back in, now filled with the weight of what she had done. 2 days later the silence was broken again, but this time by the familiar, unwelcome sound of shod horses. Silas Blackwood rode into her yard, flanked by 2 of his hired guns. One was his foreman, Jebediah Kane, a man with a brutal face and a reputation for cruelty that was known throughout the territory. Blackwood dismounted his boots, crunching on the dry earth. He took off his hat, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, but his cold eyes offered no warmth. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice a greasy drawl. "Just checking on my neighbors." "I'm not your neighbor, Mr. Blackwood," Elara said, her hand resting on the porch rail, inches from her holstered Colt, "and I'm not in need of checking on." Blackwood's smile widened, showing stained teeth. "That's where you're wrong. A woman alone. Things can happen. Accidents, fires, or worse, the natives get restless. I hear Cochise's band is moving through the dragoons again. A lonely homestead like this, it's like an open invitation." His eyes swept over her property, lingering on the creek. The threat was as clear as the water he coveted. "I'm not scared of ghosts, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady. "You should be," he sneered, his tone hardening, "especially the ones that are still breathing. I'm making you one last offer. $500 for the deed. You take it and ride out by the end of the week, or you can stay, and I'll take it for nothing once the coyotes are done with you." Jebediah Kane chuckled a low, ugly sound. He spat near her small rose bush, the one Elias had planted. That small act of disrespect ignited a cold fire in Elara's belly. She drew the Colt peacemaker. The motion was fluid, practiced. The click of the hammer being cocked was shockingly loud in the still air. Blackwood's smile vanished. His men's hands hovered over their own pistols. "This is my last offer to you, Mr. Blackwood," Elara said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Get off my land. Now." For a tense moment, no one moved. The afternoon sun beat down on the 4 of them, a tableau of simmering violence. Blackwood stared at the muzzle of the Colt, then at the unwavering resolve in her eyes. He was a bully, not a fool. He wouldn't risk getting shot himself, not when he could have his men do his dirty work later in the dark. He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Have it your way, widow," he hissed, "but you'll find this land has a steep price, and you'll pay it." He mounted his horse, his face a mask of fury. He and his men wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of choking dust and the echo of his promise hanging in the air. Ilara stood on the porch, the heavy pistol still in her hand, until the dust settled. She knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The silence that returned was the silence of a coming storm. The encounter with Blackwood left a poisonous residue on the homestead. The air felt charged, the familiar landscape menacing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the whisper of an approaching rider. Ilara slept in, Fitz the Winchester, leaning against her bedside table, the Colt under her pillow. She was no longer just a widow trying to survive. She was a woman under siege. A few days later, she hitched her mule Beatrice to the small buckboard and made the long, jarring trip into Redemption. She needed flour, salt, and cartridges for the Winchester. But more than that, she needed to see other faces, to hear other voices, to momentarily escape the suffocating bubble of fear that had enveloped her land. Redemption was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a few others clinging to life. As she guided Beatrice down the main street, she felt the change. The usual nods of greeting from the townsfolk were replaced with furtive glances and hushed whispers. Women pulled their children a little closer. Men stopped talking as she passed their eyes, hard and suspicious. The storm had already broken in town. Blackwood had been spreading his poison. Inside Abernathy's general store, the air was thick with the smell of coffee beans, leather, and smoked bacon. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced by a question mark, polished the counter with a rag, refusing to meet her eyes. Flour, salt, and a box of 4440 cartridges. Ilara said, her voice clear and firm, daring him or anyone else to challenge her. He gathered her items without a word. As he was counting her money, the door swung open, and Jebediah Kane swaggered in with two other Blackwood ranch hands. They smelled of cheap whiskey and malice. "Well, well," Kane drawled, his eyes fixing on Ilara. "Look what we have here, the Apache lover." The store went quiet. Mr. Abernathy froze his hand, hovering over the cash drawer. "Come to buy more bread for your savage friends, Mrs. Hayes." Kane continued, stepping closer. "Or maybe you're buying bullets for 'em this time." Ilara turned to face him, her expression a cold, hard mask. "I don't know what you're talking about. And even if I did, it's none of your business, Kane." "It's everyone's business when a white woman harbors a redskin killer," one of his men snarled. "Blackwood's trackers found his trail, leading right from your well, a wounded buck. Bet you patched him up real good, didn't you?" The lie was meant to inflame, to turn the town completely against her. The truth, a piece of bread and some water, was too simple. This story was better, more salacious, more damning. "You're a liar," Ilara said, her voice shaking with rage. Kane took another step, his shadow falling over her. He was trying to intimidate her, to make her cower. Maybe. But folks'll believe the story they want to believe. And right now, the story they want to believe is that Silas Blackwood is gonna get that land one way or another. He leaned in his voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He's not a patient man. I'd pack my things if I were you. Be a real shame if a stray spark from a cooking fire caught that dry timber of your cabin." Before Ilara could respond, a new voice cut through the tension, rough as gravel. That's enough, Jebediah. Jedediah Miller stood in the doorway, a double-barreled shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. The old prospector's eyes, usually twinkling with humor, were as cold and grey as river stones. Kane straightened up, a sneer on his face, but he didn't challenge the old man. Jedediah was a known quantity in the territory, a man who had survived things that would have killed lesser men. He wasn't afraid of Blackwood or his hired thugs. "Just having a conversation, old-timer," Kane grumbled. "Looked like you were finished." Jedediah said, not moving. "Now get. The smell of you is curdling the milk." Kane shot Alara one last hateful look, then turned and stomped out of the store, his men trailing behind him like curs. Jedediah watched them go, before turning to Alara. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her hands were trembling. "Thank you, Jedediah." "Don't thank me yet," he said gravely. He helped her carry her supplies out to the buckboard. "That was a warning, Alara. Blackwood's not just talk. He's got more than 30 riders on his payroll now. He's been stirring them up, telling them you're in league with the Apache, that your homestead is a danger to them all. He's building himself an excuse." "An excuse for what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "To form a posse," Jedediah said, his voice low. "To ride out and deal with the threat. He's going to try and burn you out, girl. And the law in this town won't lift a finger to stop him." The ride home was a blur of dust and dread. Jedediah's words confirmed her deepest fears. Blackwood wasn't just going to threaten her anymore. He was going to wipe her off the map. That night she didn't sleep at all. She barricaded the door with a heavy chest and shuttered the windows, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. She loaded the Winchester and the Colt, laying out the extra cartridges on the table. She sat in the dark, the silence of the cabin, a fragile skin over the pounding of her own heart. She thought of Elias, of his belief in the good of people. She had tried to honor that belief. She had offered a piece of bread to a starving man, an act of simple humanity. And for that, the world was preparing to tear her down. The wind howled outside, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to be weeping for what was to come. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, a single flickering candle against a gathering storm. And as the first hint of grey began to lighten the eastern sky, she knew the storm was about to break. Dawn came, not as a promise, but as a sentence. For Silas Blackwood, it was the perfect time to collect what he believed was his. He stood on a low rise, overlooking his sprawling ranch, a dark silhouette against the pale, bruised colors of the pre-dawn sky. Below him, 35 riders were assembled, a rough collection of desperate men, hired guns and ranch hands, loyal to his coin. They were armed with rifles, pistols, and the self-righteous fury he had so carefully cultivated. Jebediah Kane rode up beside him, a Sharps rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "They're ready, boss. Anxious to get started." "Good," Blackwood grunted, taking a long pull from a silver flask. The whiskey did little to warm the chill in his soul. "Remember the story. We're a concerned citizens posse. We're riding to investigate reports of an Apache collaborator. If she resists, well, we have to defend ourselves. And if a lamp happens to get knocked over in the struggle, no one is to blame." Kane grinned, a predatory baring of teeth. "A real tragedy. Poor widow, all alone out there. Never stood a chance." "See that it looks that way," Blackwood ordered. "I want her gone, Kane. I want the cabin a pile of ash. I want that deed, but more than that, I want that creek. By noon, our cattle will be drinking from it." He wasn't just taking her land. He was erasing her, wiping her small, defiant existence from the face of the earth. It was a matter of principle. No one defied Silas Blackwood. He looked over the faces of his men. He saw greed, fear, and a dull, brutal eagerness. He had fed them lies for weeks, lies about Elara signaling the Apache from her cabin, about her trading them ammunition, about a cache of stolen gold she was hiding for them. He gave their avarice a target and painted it with the veneer of justice. They weren't land-grabbing thugs. They were protectors of civilization, rooting out a traitor. It was a lie they were all too happy to believe. "Let's ride!" Blackwood roared, spurring his horse forward. The thunder of 35 horses shook the ground as they moved out a dark, flowing river of men and malice. They rode hard, their faces, set the rising sun at their backs, casting their long, distorted shadows before them. They were the vulture's shadow, sweeping across the land to fall upon its prey. From her fortified cabin, Elara saw the dust first. It was a faint plume against the eastern horizon, almost indistinguishable from the morning haze. But it was too uniform, too purposeful. Her heart, already a tense knot in her chest, sank with a cold, final certainty. They were coming. She moved with a calm that surprised her, the kind of clarity that comes when all other options have been stripped away. This was her home. She had bled for it, wept for it, and she would not surrender it without a fight. She checked the load in the Winchester, its cold, heavy stock a comfort in her hands. She moved from one window slit to another, her eyes scanning the landscape, tracking the growing dust cloud. She was a fool to think she could win. 35-1. It was impossible. But survival wasn't about winning. It was about standing your ground, about honoring the memory of the man who had built this place with his bare hands. It was about refusing to be broken. She thought fleetingly of the Apache warrior. She had wondered every day if he had survived, if her small act had made any difference. Now it seemed cruelly ironic. Her one act of mercy toward an Apache had brought the wrath of her own people down upon her. Perhaps the world was as simple and brutal as Blackwood believed it to be. Kindness was weakness, and she was about to pay the price. The dust cloud grew larger, resolving into individual shapes, the dark figures of riders moving at a steady, relentless pace. The rumble of their approach became a low, continuous tremor in the earth, a sound she could feel in her bones. They were close now. 10 minutes, maybe less. She rested the barrel of the Winchester in the slit of the front window, took a deep breath to steady her hands, and sighted down the long barrel. She would not fire first. She would not give them that excuse. But the first man who tried to set foot on her porch would be the last. A profound and terrible loneliness washed over her. Here in this small box of wood and sod, she would make her stand. Her life had been reduced to this single point, this final act of defiance against the greed and hatred of men like Blackwood. She offered up a silent prayer not for salvation, but for strength. Then she fixed her gaze on the approaching riders and waited for the end to begin. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and horseflesh. The rumble of Blackwood's riders was a physical force, now a wave of sound that vibrated through the cabin walls. Elara could make out their faces, hard, grim, and eager. Blackwood was at the forefront with Kane beside him, his expression one of smug triumph. They fanned out as they approached, forming a loose semicircle around the homestead, cutting off any possibility of escape. Elara's world narrowed to the small patch of dirt visible through the window slit. Her finger was tight on the trigger of the Winchester, the metal cool against her skin. This was it. The moment hovered, stretched thin and brittle, ready to shatter into violence. Blackwood reined in his horse 50 yards from the cabin. "Mrs. Hayes!" He bellowed his voice, carrying an artificial tone of authority. "We are a posse, acting under the authority of the citizens of this territory. You are accused of consorting with hostile Apache. Come out with your hands raised." Ilara didn't answer. Her silence was her defiance. "Have it your way." Blackwood snarled, his patience gone. "Kane, you and your boys go knock on her door. If she's not hospitable, burn it down." Kane and 4 other men dismounted, carrying torches that had already been doused in oil. They began to advance on the cabin, their boots crunching on the dry ground. Ilara drew a bead on Kane's chest. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. 1 step onto the porch, she promised herself. Just 1 step. And then a new sound. It was different from the deliberate shod-horse rhythm of Blackwood's men. This was a deeper, wilder thunder. It wasn't coming from the east, but from the west, from the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. Ilara's head snapped toward the sound. Blackwood and his men heard it too. They turned in their saddles, their confident smirks faltering, replaced by confusion. The sound grew rapidly, a low, ominous roar that seemed to rise from the very earth. Then they saw them. Pouring out of the canyons and gullies of the foothills, as if born from the rock itself, was a wave of riders. They were not clad in denim and leather, but in the simple breechcloths and moccasins of the Apache. They rode with a breathtaking skill, their lean bodies moving as one with their bareback ponies. Sunlight glinted off rifle barrels and lance tips. They were silent, their faces painted for war, their expressions as hard and unforgiving as the mountains they called home. And at their head, riding a powerful paint horse, was the man she had given bread to. He was transformed. The starving, wounded fugitive was gone. In his place was a war chief, his body radiating a raw power and authority. The gash on his ribs was healing, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter than ever. His name was Taza, though Ilara did not know it. And he was not alone. Behind him rode 50 warriors, 50 Chiricahua Apache, the most feared and respected fighters in the territory. They moved not with the clumsy formation of Blackwood's posse, but with a fluid, terrifying grace, a living arrow loosed from the mountains aimed directly at the heart of the land-grabber's small army. Blackwood stared, his jaw slack with disbelief. His men murmured and shifted uneasily in their saddles, their bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. This wasn't in the plan. They had come for a lone woman, in a cabin, not to face the fury of an Apache war party. Kane and his men, halfway to the cabin, froze in their tracks, the unlit torches, suddenly feeling foolish and heavy in their hands. They looked from the cabin to the approaching warriors, their faces pale with a primal fear. The Apache riders didn't slow. The thunder of their hooves was a deafening roar, now the sound of a debt being called due. They swept into the valley and formed a line between Ilara's cabin and Blackwood's men, a wall of bronze skin and righteous fury. The dust they kicked up swirled around them, making them appear like vengeful spirits rising from the earth. Silence fell. A tense electric silence, broken only by the snorting of horses and the panicked breathing of Blackwood's men. The two groups faced each other across the 100 yards of sun-scorched earth that had become the line between life and death. Taza urged his horse forward a few paces. He raised a hand, not in peace, but in command. He looked past Blackwood, his dark eyes, finding the small slit in the cabin window, where he knew she was watching. The acknowledgement was clear. He had returned. For a long moment, the two forces faced each other in a standoff, thick with hatred and disbelief. Silas Blackwood, his face purple with rage and confusion, finally found his voice. "What is this?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "What business do you have here, you heathen savages?" Taza's gaze shifted from the cabin to Blackwood. His English was slow, deliberate, each word carved from stone. "This land," he said, his voice carrying with an unnerving calm across the divide, is under the protection of the Chiricahua. A nervous laugh escaped Blackwood. Protection. You protect nothing. This is settler land. We have a dispute with the woman in that cabin. It has nothing to do with you. You are wrong, Taza replied, his eyes cold. Your dispute is with a woman who showed honor when my enemies showed only steel. Your men hunt my people for coin. Your cattle drink the water and leave none for the deer. You bring fire to the home of one who gave a starving man water. You have no honor. Therefore your dispute is with me. The simple, profound logic of his words hung in the air. Blackwood, blinded by a lifetime of prejudice and greed, couldn't comprehend it. To him this was an aberration, a tear in the fabric of the world he understood. I have 35 guns here, Blackwood shrieked, gesturing wildly at his men. We will wipe you from this valley. It was a bluff born of desperation, and everyone knew it. His men were ranch hands and hired thugs, not seasoned warriors. They were already looking for escape routes. Taza didn't dignify the threat with a verbal response. He simply raised his hand and let it fall. It was as if a dam broke. The Apache war cry, a sound that terrified the bravest of soldiers, erupted from 50 throats. The Apache line surged forward, not in a straight, predictable charge, but in a swirling, chaotic pattern. They broke into smaller groups, weaving and circling, firing their rifles from beneath their ponies' necks, loosing arrows that flew with deadly accuracy. Blackwood's posse disintegrated into chaos. Their volley of shots was panicked and wild, most of them kicking up dust far from any target. The Apache masters of this terrain used every dip and rock for cover. They were a whirlwind of motion and death impossible to track, impossible to fight. From her window, Elara watched the terrifying spectacle unfold. This was not the clumsy brawling of saloon fights. It was a science of warfare. She saw a warrior go down his horse, shot from under him. Before one of Blackwood's men could finish him, Elara raised the Winchester, took a steadying breath, and fired. The man crumpled to the ground. She worked the lever action, her fear replaced by a cold, focused purpose. This was her fight, too. She fired again, and then a third time, not with hatred, but with the grim necessity of a survivor. Jebediah Cain, seeing the battle was lost, let out a roar of pure rage. He abandoned the idea of burning the cabin and charged not at the swirling warriors, but at Taza himself, firing his pistol wildly. He was a beast of a man, driven by a simple, brutal calculus. If he could kill the chief, the attack might break. Taza saw him coming. Instead of firing his rifle, he dropped it, drawing a long-bladed knife. It was a matter of honor. This man's insult was personal. He spurred his horse to meet Cain's charge. The two men collided with a crash of horseflesh and a snarl of human fury. Both were knocked from their saddles. They landed heavily in the dust and came up fighting. Cain was bigger and stronger, swinging his fists like hammers. Taza was faster, more agile, moving like a panther. The battle raged around them, a maelstrom of gunfire arrows and dying screams. But for these two men, the world had shrunk to the space between them. Cain managed to land a bruising blow that sent Taza staggering back. He lunged, trying to pin the Apache leader down, but Taza twisted his knife, flashing in the sun. He moved inside Cain's clumsy guard, and the fight ended as quickly as it had begun. Cain stared down in disbelief at the handle of the knife protruding from his chest. He looked up at Taza, his eyes wide with a final gasping surprise, and then collapsed into the dust. The death of the foreman broke the last of the posse's will. Those who were still mounted turned and fled, galloping madly back the way they had come, pursued by the chilling cries of the Apache. Blackwood, his face a mask of utter terror, was among the first to run his horse, whipped into a lather, his dreams of water and conquest dissolving into a desperate scramble for his own life. The battle had lasted less than 10 minutes. The dust began to settle, revealing the aftermath. A dozen of Blackwood's men lay dead or dying in the yard. The rest were scattered to the winds. The Apache had lost 3 warriors. The silence that returned was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and blood. The warriors began to move through the battlefield, quietly tending to their fallen and collecting the weapons of their enemies. Taza retrieved his knife, wiping it clean on the dead foreman's shirt. He stood for a moment, surveying the scene. Then he turned and walked toward the cabin. He stopped at the porch steps, his face grim, his body spattered with dust and blood. He waited. Slowly the cabin door creaked open. Ilara emerged, the Winchester held loosely at her side. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but she stood tall. She looked at Taza, at the carnage in her yard, at the stoic warriors who now stood guard over her home. The Apache chief looked at her, and the hardness in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "The woman who gives bread to the hungry," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "will not see her home burn." The debt was paid. The sun climbed higher, baking the blood into the thirsty earth of Ilara's yard. The Apache warriors worked with a quiet, solemn efficiency. They carried their fallen brothers to their ponies, preparing to take them back to the sacred ground of the mountains for burial. There was no celebration in their victory, only a grim, dignified closure. Ilara stood on her porch, watching, feeling like a stranger in her own life. The world she had known just hours before, a world of lonely survival and quiet fear, had been shattered and remade by a storm of violence she could barely comprehend. Taza approached her again. He had bound a fresh strip of cloth around a cut on his arm, but otherwise seemed unharmed. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, maintaining a respectful distance. "The vulture Blackwood, he will not return," Taza said. It wasn't a guess. It was a statement of fact. He has lost too many men. He has lost his teeth, and he knows this valley is watched. "Why?" Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question was a universe of meaning. Why me? Why risk so much for a stranger? An enemy, Taza, looked away toward the Dragoon Mountains, his home. When your people came to this land, many great leaders of the Indi people sought peace. My grandfather was one. He was betrayed and killed under a flag of truce. My father fought the soldiers. He was killed in an ambush by men who hunt us for the money your government pays for our scalps. It was such men who ambushed my small band 3 days ago. My wife, my son, they were with me. I alone escaped wounded." He paused, and for the first time, Ilara saw past the warrior and into the man. She saw a grief that mirrored her own, a loss as profound and hollow as the one she carried for Elias. "I ran until I could run no more," he continued, his gaze returning to her. "I was ready to die in the shadow of my enemy's world. I expected a bullet. Instead, you gave me water. You gave me bread. You looked at me, and you did not see a savage. You saw a man. In the world I have known, this is a thing of great power. My people, they follow the word of Kochise, and Kochise teaches that honor is the spine of a man. A debt of honor must be paid. Your act was not small. It told me that not all of you are like Blackwood. It told me that hope is not yet dead." He reached into a small pouch at his waist and pulled out a single, perfect eagle feather, tied with a thin strip of blue-dyed leather. He walked up the steps and gently laid it on the porch railing. "This is a sign," he said. "For any who see it, they will know this home is protected." You are Shil-la-a-Shijin, friend of the Apache. You will not be alone again." Ilara looked from the feather to his face. Tears she didn't know she had left began to well in her eyes. "Thank you." She said the words, feeling small and inadequate. Taza simply nodded. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and gave a sharp command in his own tongue. The Apache warriors, their grim work finished, fell into a line behind him. They moved away from the homestead, a silent, flowing procession that melted back toward the mountains, leaving the morning sun to shine on a valley that was now finally truly hers. She was left with the dead and the silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of fear and loneliness, but the silence of peace, of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. She knew the story of what happened here would become a legend whispered in towns like Redemption, with fear and awe. The widow who was saved by the savages she had befriended. But Ilara knew the truth was simpler and far more profound. It wasn't a story about savages and settlers. It was a story about two people cornered by a cruel world who had chosen to see the humanity in each other. And in that single shared moment, they had found not just survival, but salvation. She picked up the eagle feather, its edge soft against her calloused fingers, and looked toward the mountains, her heart full of a strange and powerful hope for the new dawn. The seasons turned, and the fierce heat of the Arizona summer bled into the crisp, cool air of autumn. The scars on Ilara's land began to heal. Wild grasses grew over the patches of earth that had been soaked with blood, and the wind and rain washed away the last traces of the desperate battle. The silence that returned to the valley was no longer menacing or lonely. It was a deep, abiding peace, the kind Ilara had once thought was lost to her forever. She did not see the Apache again, but she knew they were there. Sometimes in the quiet of the morning, she would find a brace of quail or a freshly killed rabbit left on a flat stone near the creek, placed with a care that was unmistakable. In return, she would leave a small sack of cornmeal or a few jars of the wild berry preserves she'd put up. It was a silent conversation, a commerce of respect between her small, quiet world and the vast wild one of the mountains. The eagle feather Taza had left remained on her porch railing, its colors vibrant against the weathered wood, a symbol no passing rider prospector or traveler dared to question. One afternoon, as the first hint of winter chilled the air, a familiar figure rode into her valley. It was Jedediah Miller, his old mule, looking as grizzled and resolute as he was. He dismounted, his eyes taking in the quiet homestead, the healthy-looking corn stalks ready for their final harvest, and the woman on the porch who seemed to carry herself differently. "Ilara," he said, nodding, a slow smile spreading across his whiskered face. "You look well. The mountain air agrees with you." "It's quiet, Jedediah," she replied, offering him a seat and a cup of coffee she had brewing. "Something I've come to appreciate." They sat for a while, the silence comfortable between them. "I bring news from Redemption," he finally said, getting to the purpose of his visit. "The town is different." He told her how Blackwood's surviving men had limped back into town, bringing with them a wild, terrified story of a massacre of the earth itself, seeming to spit out Apache warriors to defend the widow's homestead. At first, no one believed them. But then Blackwood himself returned a broken, haunted man. He sold his herds for a fraction of their worth, his land for whatever he could get, and disappeared back east, the vulture's wings clipped for good. The story has grown into a legend. Jedediah chuckled. "They don't call you the widow's burden anymore. Some call you the spirit woman of the dragoons. Others, the ones who are more scared than respectful, they call you the Apache Queen." He shook his head in amusement. "They say you command the spirits of the mountains, that Cries himself dines at your table. The fear they used to have for the Apache, well, now they have it for you, and a good dose of respect with it. No one will trouble you again, girl. You've become more myth than woman in their eyes." Ilara looked out at the land that was truly hers, bought not just with Elias's sweat, but with her own courage. She wasn't a queen or a spirit woman. She was just Ilara Hayes. But she understood that the world needed bigger stories to explain simple truths. "And what do you call me, Jedediah?" she asked quietly. The old prospector took a long sip of his coffee, his gaze thoughtful. "I call you a good neighbor," he said. "The kind this land needs more of. The kind who understands that a man's thirst is more important than the color of his skin." After he left, Ilara walked to the edge of her property, to the whispering creek that Blackwood had coveted. The water ran clear and cold over the smooth stones. She was no longer just a homesteader clinging to a piece of dirt. She was a part of this place, connected to it by a bond of blood honor and bread. She had learned the territory's deepest lesson, that the land does not belong to those who seize it, but to those who respect it and all the life it holds. As the sun began to set, casting long golden fingers of light through the canyon, she looked up at the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. High on a distant ridge, she saw a thin solitary plume of smoke rising into the darkening sky. It was not a war signal or a warning. It was the smoke of a cooking fire, a sign of life, of a home. It was a silent acknowledgement, an echo across the vastness. Taza and his people were there. They were watching. She was not alone, and for the first time since Elias's passing, Ilara Hayes felt the profound and unbreakable peace of being truly, finally home. That single piece of bread, given in a moment of shared humanity, did more than save one man's life. It purchased peace for a valley forged an alliance between two worlds, and proved that even in the harshest wilderness, the most powerful force is not greed or hatred, but a simple act of compassion. The story of Ilara Hayes and the warrior Taza reminds us that our choices, no matter how small they seem, can send ripples through history, and that the greatest courage is often found in reaching out a hand when the world expects you to raise a fist. If this story of courage, honor, and the surprising bonds forged in the fires of the Old West moved you, please help us share it. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it. Share this video with someone who loves a great story. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from history's forgotten corners. Click that notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. Thank you for listening.